Late one evening, as I stood with a spray can in hand, I thought about how I've become a creature of habit, lurking in the shadows to leave my mark where no one else dares. To some, I'm a graffiti artist. To others, a mere delinquent. But I don't care much for the labels. I'm just drawn to the spray and the solitude. My world has shrunk to abandoned places, derelict train tracks where old freight cars lie forgotten and rusting, hidden from prying eyes and the disdain of other so-called artists. In this lonely expanse, the sense of territory and respect has eroded to nothing. There's only one person who gets it, who gets me, Caleb. Caleb doesn't care much about tagging, but he enjoys the adventure. He's one of the few who respects my time, my quirks. So that night, we found ourselves wandering down a deserted stretch of train tracks I had spotted on some backwater map earlier. The sky was an inky black, and the air was thick with the promise of something sinister. Caleb lit up a joint, and though I'm not much of a smoker these days, too much anxiety, I indulged, trying to match his relaxed vibe. It wasn't too late, just past 10 p.m., when we stumbled upon a long line of freight cars. They were untouched, pristine canvases waiting for my paint. The silence was palpable, broken only by the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. I passed Caleb a can, though I knew he wouldn't do much with it, and set to work. The adrenaline coursed through me as I tagged the first car, then the next, and the one after that. The night swallowed the sound of the spray, and for a moment, it was just me, the paint, and the darkness. 15 minutes passed, and I was 3 tags in, feeling a quiet pride in the work I'd done. But as I discarded my empty cans, flinging them into the darkness, I felt a pang of unease. Something was off. Caleb had already moved on, barely touching the can I gave him. He was on his second joint, lost in his own world. I wasn't far behind, feeling the familiar creeping dread that comes with being too high for comfort. The last spark from his joint faded into the night, and then, out of nowhere, we heard it, a metallic clang from somewhere in the dark. We froze, staring into the void where the sound had come from. My heart raced, adrenaline now flooding my veins with an icy dread. Was it inside the train? Outside? It was impossible to tell, and each option seemed worse than the last. We stood there, statues in the night, for what felt like an eternity. Nothing happened. The silence was maddening. I pulled out my phone, recording in a shaky attempt to capture proof of the unease settling over us. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Caleb nodded, eyes wide with fear. Before we could process what was happening, another clang echoed in the night, louder this time, closer. Then, out of the darkness, something flew at us. It clattered on the ground near my feet. A paint can, one of mine, thrown with force. Panic set in as we heard footsteps heavy and fast coming our way. We ran, fueled by fear, the sound of a voice, angry, threatening, echoing in our ears. "You better not trip, boy!" The words cut through the night, almost drowning out the sudden, deafening gunshot that followed. The bang was so loud, so close, that I could feel it reverberate through my bones. Caleb nearly stumbled, and I lost my grip on the phone, the video cutting off as we bolted down the tracks. We didn't stop running until we were on a main road, the train tracks far behind us. The silence in the car ride home was suffocating, the kind that settles in after you've faced something truly terrifying. I couldn't shake the sound of that shot, the way the darkness seemed to close in on us. Reporting it wasn't an option. We were the ones breaking the law. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, in broad daylight and with a Glock tucked into my waistband, I returned to those tracks. The freight cars were still there, unchanged except for one glaring detail. My tags were gone, replaced by ugly splashes of red paint deliberately smearing over where my work had been. It was as if someone wanted to erase any trace that I had been there. I kept moving down the line, unease growing with every step, until I came to a car with its door ajar. Inside was a scene straight out of a nightmare. A single chair bolted to the floor, surrounded by ropes and chains strewn about haphazardly. The stench of bleach was overpowering, thick in the air, making my eyes water. It was like stepping into a cleaning closet soaked in chemicals. The ropes were worn, some wrapped around the chair's legs, others lying in twisted piles on the floor. The whole setup felt wrong, like I had stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to see. I reached for my phone to document the scene, but then I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of metal clanging further down the line. It wasn't my imagination. Someone, or something, was still out there. I didn't wait around to find out what. I backed out of that train car as fast as I could, heart pounding, and left the tracks behind for good. I've shared this story countless times, but no one can make sense of it. Why someone would react so violently to a few tags, or why they felt the need to cover them up afterward, is a mystery. The chair in the train car haunts me the most, a silent, ominous presence in a place that should have been forgotten. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I can still hear that gunshot ringing in my ears, and it sends a chill down my spine that I can't shake. It's early August as I pen this down, recalling the chilling events that took place at the start of summer. Usually, I spend my summers either hanging around my college town or traveling to Europe to avoid going back home. But this time, that wasn't an option. I found myself reluctantly heading back to my hometown at the beginning of the summer, with the thought that I only had to endure 1 week before boarding a plane to Germany. I wasn't particularly excited to see any of my old friends, but I wasn't too thrilled about staying at home either. So, I ended up waking up early each day, spending hours hiking, watching movies, or just driving around with no destination in mind. On my last day at home, boredom started creeping in from all the repetitive activities, and I craved something a bit more thrilling. Back in the day, my friends and I used to engage in some reckless activities, one of which was train hopping, a dangerous habit that I had long since left behind. But that day, in my restless state, I thought, why not? And drove out to a secluded set of tracks I knew about. Freight trains frequently passed through there, offering plenty of opportunities for adventure. The tracks were surrounded by dense trees and wild vegetation, which was part of why I chose the spot. The last thing I needed was to get caught doing something illegal after staying clean for so many years. I parked my car at a hidden spot and made my way over to the tracks. Let me describe the layout so it's easier to understand. This specific stretch of tracks ran through thick woods for a while before entering a long, dark tunnel. On the other side of the tunnel was a small clearing, followed by a massive bridge that spanned over a deep ravine. My friends and I used to ride the trains all the way across the bridge, but since I was alone this time, I knew I'd have no way of getting back to my car unless I walked for miles. So, I decided I'd hop on a train, ride it through the tunnel, and then jump off to enjoy a peaceful walk back to my car. I wandered along the tracks, waiting for a train to pass. It was probably around 3 or 4 in the afternoon. After about 15 minutes of walking, I finally started to feel that familiar vibration in the rails. Quickly, I dashed to the side, doing my best to stay hidden from view. As far as I knew, freight train conductors typically didn't care enough to report someone walking along the tracks, but I wasn't about to take any chances. The train roared past me, and I waited until a good number of cars had gone by before stepping out from my hiding spot. I picked a car that seemed easy to latch onto and began jogging alongside the train, just like I had done countless times before. Once I felt confident, I grabbed hold of the ladder and pulled myself up. It was pretty easy. The train wasn't moving very fast. As my section of the train approached the tunnel, I suddenly noticed a strange flash of light ahead. At first, I assumed it was just a spark from the train or something similar. But in truth, I'd never seen anything like it before. I wondered if there might be a frayed wire or some kind of danger within the tunnel, but it was too late to jump off now. The train was picking up speed as it entered the darkness. The tunnel was perfectly straight, and as adrenaline began to surge through me, I closed my eyes. Just then, I felt it. A cold, clammy hand reached out from the shadows and grabbed my leg. I nearly lost my grip and slipped, but my hands were still tightly clutching the ladder. I screamed and kicked wildly, but the train sped on before I could make contact with whatever was down there. Before I could even process what had just happened, I felt another hand slap against my leg. Panicking, I scrambled further up the ladder, praying I was out of reach. My heart was racing. What the hell had just happened? The train emerged from the tunnel, and without thinking, I leaped off onto the ground. I watched as the train chugged its way over the bridge, trying to calm my nerves, but my mind was racing with questions. Were there really people in that tunnel, and what on earth were they doing there? Why would they try to pull me down? As I paced back and forth in the small clearing, a horrifying realization struck me. The only way back to my car was through that tunnel. There was no way in hell I was walking back through there with those people, if they even were people, lurking in the darkness, especially knowing they could see my silhouette while I'd be completely blind. I sat on the ground for what felt like an eternity, trying to figure out my next move. There were no other options. I couldn't risk crossing the bridge on foot. A train could come along at any second, and it was too long to cross safely. I briefly considered calling someone to come rescue me, but I wasn't sure they'd be able to do anything. Besides, calling the police wasn't an option. I was already breaking the law just by being there. With no other choice, I picked up a rock for some semblance of protection and started making my way back through the tunnel. I knew there had been at least 2 figures in there, but for all I knew, there could have been more. I had no idea what I was walking into. About halfway through, I started hearing it, a faint clicking sound echoing from deep within the tunnel. It sounded like someone clicking their tongue, but it also had an unnatural, mechanical edge to it. My blood ran cold as I froze in place. Continuing through this tunnel felt like a death sentence. But then, in a moment of sheer desperation, I pulled out my phone and shouted into the darkness, "You better stay back or I'll shoot." My voice echoed off the tunnel walls, and for a moment the clicking stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I knew I was bluffing about having a gun, but I figured it was better to take a chance than to walk in silence, vulnerable to whatever was in there with me. I quickly pulled up a video with gunshot sound effects, turned up my phone's volume as high as it would go, and hit play. The sound was louder than I expected, amplified by the tunnel's acoustics. I prayed that whoever or whatever was in there bought the bluff. Without waiting another second, I sprinted full speed into the darkness, ready for a fight. I didn't stop running until I reached the other side of the tunnel, gasping for breath. Once outside, I turned to look back at the tunnel, my heart pounding. I could barely make out 2 silhouettes standing on the tracks, facing me. That was the final straw. I turned and started jogging away, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and that cursed tunnel. But just as I thought I was safe, the most horrific screech I've ever heard echoed out from within the tunnel. It was a sound that was unmistakably human, yet utterly inhuman at the same time. Barbaric and primal. something that didn't belong in this world. I don't know what was in that tunnel, and I have no desire to ever find out. One thing is for certain, though. I'll never hop a train again. The subway system in Baltimore can be a terrifying place. I've worked for the Transit Authority of Maryland, TAM, for about 7 years now, and honestly, very little shocks me anymore. But when friends and family ask if I have any strange stories to share, there's one that always stands out. A story I still can't explain. This incident happened about 2 years into my job, but I remember it like it just happened yesterday. By that time, I had become used to the routine, and nothing felt unusual anymore. I was stationed at the time at Monroe Station in Baltimore, doing some routine maintenance. The platform was completely deserted, which felt strange in itself. Normally, these stations are bustling with people, so to see one empty, almost abandoned, was unsettling. I hadn't seen another soul for hours, and the only sounds were the faint hum of the overhead lights and the occasional rumble of a passing train. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I heard a loud clang echoing from somewhere down the track. The sound startled me so much that I dropped my mop. It wasn't a sound I'd usually hear. It was the kind of noise you'd expect if someone had dropped a rock onto the metal rails. I froze, staring into the tunnel, listening for any more noises. After a few moments of silence, I figured it was probably just an animal or maybe a loose piece of cement falling from the old station walls. I shrugged it off and went back to work, trying not to let it bother me. About 10 minutes later, that same sound happened again, this time twice as loud. My pulse quickened, and now I was genuinely concerned. I mean, what were the chances that 2 chunks of ceiling had fallen within 10 minutes? I carefully set my supplies down and walked toward the entrance of the tunnel, trying to keep my footsteps quiet. Peering into the darkness, I couldn't make out anything unusual. For a moment, I debated whether or not to call out into the tunnel, but ultimately decided against it. I figured it was still probably nothing. But after the fear subsided, confusion began to creep in. I couldn't shake the thought, what could have caused that noise twice in such a short time? And why did the second sound seem louder? I forced myself to refocus, trying to get back into a rhythm with my work. Soon, I was almost done with my shift and relieved to think that I'd be leaving that eerie station soon. But just as I was wrapping things up, I heard something that chilled me to my core, the voice of a child calling for help from inside the tunnel. The voice was faint but unmistakable, and it sounded panicked, desperate. I immediately stopped what I was doing and hurried over to the edge of the platform. I hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at me, but I knew I couldn't just ignore a child in distress. Ignoring every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I stepped down onto the tracks and stood still, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I shouted into the tunnel, asking if the kid was okay. No response. The silence made my skin crawl, and I started to feel more nervous than I had been before. Then, the child's voice echoed again, repeating the call for help. I shouted back, asking if he could hear me, and finally a reply came. "Yes." I asked where he was, hoping for some direction. There was a brief, unsettling pause before the child's voice came again. "In front of you. Just keep walking." I froze. Every fiber of my being told me that something wasn't right about this. I didn't want to move forward, but I couldn't just leave a child alone on the tracks. It was too dangerous. I reluctantly took a few steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Then a terrifying thought hit me. I stopped in my tracks and shouted into the tunnel again, asking the child what was wrong. After another uncomfortable pause, the child's voice replied, "Just keep walking." My stomach churned. Something about the way he said it felt wrong. My eyes had finally adjusted to the dark, and up ahead I could make out a faint shadow on the tracks. A small figure, one that looked like it could be a child. But then I saw something else. Something that made my blood run cold. There was another shadow, this one much taller, standing just behind the child. It was clearly the silhouette of an adult. I stood there, paralyzed by fear, trying to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. This kind of thing doesn't happen. Slowly, I turned around, doing my best not to make any sudden movements, and started to make my way back to the platform. Every step felt like an eternity. As I climbed back onto the platform, the child's voice called out again, louder this time. "Wait! Where are you going?" I didn't answer. I wasn't sticking around to find out what was going on. I ran up the stairs, my heart racing, and as soon as I had cell service, I called the police. I explained everything to them, still trying to catch my breath. Within minutes, officers were swarming the platform, searching the tunnels. After about 20 minutes of looking around, one of the officers found something that made my skin crawl. A single small shoe lying on the tracks deep within the tunnel. The police suggested it might have been a sign of a struggle, but no one else was found. They searched for hours, combing through every possible record of missing children, but nothing came up. The official conclusion was that whoever had been down there had managed to hide somewhere deeper in the tunnels. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that there was something much more sinister going on. My theory? Some deranged man kidnapped a child and used him to lure someone into the tunnel, planning to ambush them. Maybe it was their own kid, and they were raising him to be just as twisted. It's hard to say, but one thing is certain. Whatever was going on down in that tunnel, I'm lucky I didn't find out the hard way.